Hello, explorers, and welcome back to a Q&A episode of Unbroken. This is Q&A episode 11, and I'm so happy to have you here. My name is Alexandra Amor, and these are the episodes of the podcast where I answer your questions. So just a reminder, you can submit a question that you've got about unwanted habits, anything like that, to alexandraamor.com/question. There's a form there you can fill out, and I'll be happy to answer your question on a future episode. So today the question is, what is anxiety? And this is a topic close to my heart because I've got a funny story about my own personal experience with anxiety that I'll get to in just a second. So very simply, anxiety is our body's way of letting us know that we're caught up in some insecure thinking. That's all it is. It's very simple. It's actually the opposite of what it can look like to us, which I think is what makes it such an interesting topic. It's not a problem, and we'll talk about why that is in just a second. It's not something we need to manage or control. I mean, very similarly to cravings that we have when we have an unwanted habit. Anxiety is information from the wisdom and the universal energy, life energy that's within all of us. So I'll talk about that a bit more in just a second. Right now, I want to share my personal experience, just so you know that I know whereof I speak. So for years, I experienced a form of anxiety that I would describe as urgency. The really funny thing about it is I didn't know that that's what it was. And that's really, put a pin in that, I guess is what I'll say, because it's really interesting that we misunderstand the messages that are coming from our body and our wisdom. And that was absolutely true for me. So for as long as I could remember, I felt a sense of urgency. I wouldn't say, of course, I can't say 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, especially around work and also around things like running errands, for example. So that was one that was really puzzling for me. So if I had a list of, let's say, 4 errands that I needed to run, I would be out doing them, and I would get to the second one and start to feel this sense of urgency, like I just needed the errands to be finished. And inevitably, probably 9 times out of 10, maybe more, I would just say, oh, forget it about the last 2 errands on the list, and I would go home. And that was because that information that was going on in my body, that feeling of urgency, it felt like information to me that was pertinent to the situation that I was in. And it was only much later, once I began to explore this inside out understanding, that I realized that wasn't what it was. And the funny thing is, I never would have described myself as an anxious person. Like I said, it was very specifically a sense of urgency that I felt. And then I was listening to Nicola Bird's podcast, A Little Piece of Mind, probably back in 2018. And she had a guest on. And I don't remember who the guest was. But as they were having their conversation, the guest happened to say, he just happened to mention that urgency was the same as anxiety. It was just in a different form. And I was really struck by that. It really turned my world upside down. It was one of those moments I just thought, wait a second. And until then, I had been really attracted to her podcast. I listened to it every week and I really enjoyed it. And the funny thing was, if I had thought about it logically, I didn't understand why that was, that I was really enjoying it. And then when this guest said that thing, I realized, oh, okay, now I get it. I can really relate to what was going on when her guests would talk about anxiety because, like the guest said, urgency is just another form of anxiety. So once I saw that, I was absolutely thrilled. And the nice thing is that, and I'm going to go on and explain a little bit more about anxiety and that kind of thing, but the nice thing is about exploring this understanding was that what I noticed was that gradually, without doing anything really, the anxiety or the urgency that I felt just started to fall away. And I still experience it occasionally, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. Um, it just it was so interesting to me that simply by looking in this direction, by learning more about how we work from the inside out, how thought is this river of energy moving through us, and our experiences and our circumstances are two separate things, even though we often conflate them. So just by exploring, being an explorer in this understanding, that sense of urgency has fallen away from me for the most part. And when it does crop up now, I don't really get too bothered by it. And I certainly don't listen to it the way I used to. Okay, so let's dive into a bit of what that feeling is then, whether it's a feeling of urgency or anxiety. What's really going on is that we are always feeling our thinking. So we are perfectly designed. I mixed up divine design and perfect right there, but yeah, we are divinely designed, and we are in our bodies. We are always feeling the quality of the thinking that's going on in our minds, and those two things are always happening simultaneously, which is entirely normal and natural. And it's actually helpful, when we feel feelings of anxiety, that's actually a really helpful tool that we have as we operate in the world and navigate our lives. Because what it's telling us is that the quality of our thinking is not so great, that our thinking has really sped up, it's become quite insecure, quite busy. And that feeling of anxiety is what is going to tell us that, because it's going to get our attention. And so in that way, anxiety is information for sure. It's just not the information that we tend to interpret it as. So for example, the misunderstanding we tend to have is that anxiety is information about the outside world. So when we innocently believe that the world works in an outside in kind of way, that then when we feel anxiety or urgency like I did, we think that that's information about what's going on outside of us. So for example, if someone has anxiety about being in a car, then they feel like that anxiety is about the car. It's about being in the car. It's about being nervous about traffic. If someone feels anxious when they go more than 25 minutes from their home, which is a specific example from Nicola Bird, then when that happens, when they get, 24 minutes away from their house, they feel that anxiety that they're feeling is information that they should pay attention to and then return to their home, that sort of thing. If someone feels anxiety about bridges, they think that the anxiety that they feel is actually about the bridges that are on the outside of themselves. But again, that's not what anxiety is. Anxiety is simply information letting us know the quality of our thinking. And we're constantly getting that information from our bodies. And there's this perfect feedback system that exists, within us, or it is what we are. So when we start to get those butterflies in our stomach, or sweaty palms, or the sort of panicky feelings about the situation that we think our anxiety is about, what that's really about is that we have a lot of, just like I said, sped up, insecure thinking about a given situation or person or bridge or whatever it is. And so what we can do when we feel that kind of anxiety is simply notice that it's there and notice that it's making a comment on the quality of our thinking. It has nothing to do with bridges or traffic or cars or anything like that. And unfortunately, what can often happen with anxiety is once we feel the initial feeling and misunderstand it, think it's about the bridge or the traffic, then we innocently layer a whole bunch more thinking on top of that. So this is what happens when we create our lives so that we avoid situations that we think are making us anxious. So if someone's anxious about bridges, they might arrange their world, and go from A to B, making sure that they don't have to drive over a bridge. And the more that we assign that anxiety to things that are going on outside of us, to bridges, to traffic, to cars, whatever it is, the smaller our world becomes. And this is really sad and unfortunate, when we misinterpret these signals from our body. What we naturally tend to do is try to avoid the situation that we believe is creating the anxiety. So circling back to my urgency situation and my running errands thing, I was doing the best I could in that moment by not doing the last couple of errands that were on my list. So that was my innocent response to that feeling of urgency, right? The feeling of urgency is there. I think it's giving me information about these errands that I'm running. And in order to make that feeling go away, naturally, because I misunderstand where it's coming from, I think to myself, okay, I'm just going to forget those last 2 errands and go home. And that's what I did for decades, probably 3 decades. And to a certain degree, it worked. The only problem is that then I wasn't living the life that I wanted to lead. I was kind of living my life at times at the mercy of that feeling of urgency because I misunderstood what it was telling me. And that's really unfortunate. And in my case, that was a pretty minor example. That was, I would say, the urgency affected me in a lot of different ways in my life, but that's kind of the most concrete example. And even so, that's not that serious. I mean, we've all heard of, and maybe you are someone who, has become frightened of leaving their house because the way that they feel they can avoid the feelings of anxiety that they feel is by not doing the things that bring up the anxiety or that they misunderstand are bringing up the anxiety. And again, that's exactly what I did. I thought the errands were the thing that were giving me the anxiety, so I just stopped doing them and went home. So what can we do about this? When we start to feel feelings of anxiety, if you're someone who experiences them a little or a lot. And as with all the exploring that we're doing about the inside out nature of life, there are 2 things that are really important. One is simply continuing your exploration. And I've got a resource that I'm going to give you at the end of this episode. So listening to podcasts like mine and others, Nicola Bird's is specifically about anxiety. But what's really important to notice is that no matter what anyone who's exploring this understanding is sharing, they're all pointing in the same direction. So even if you're listening to a podcast about one of my podcast episodes, for example, about cravings or overeating or any kind of overing habit, because we're talking about principles of how being human works, those principles apply to every aspect of life. So they apply to our overing habits, our unwanted habits, and they apply to anxiety as well. So when we begin to understand that, when we begin to see how it is our human system is designed, and that the design is always trying to help us, not hinder us at all, then I can just go back to my personal experiences. Then my feelings of urgency and anxiety just started to fall away on their own because I understood what was happening. And even now, I still do experience urgency. It does come up from time to time. And it's just as uncomfortable as it was back when I didn't understand what it was. The difference now is that, first of all, I know that because that feeling is part of my divine design, I don't need to be afraid of it. The second thing is I know that it's going to pass by. I know that that feeling is part of the river of thought with a capital T that is flowing through me, and that it will move on. I'll get distracted, something will change. If I'm anxious about, let's say, anytime I've given a public talk or I've been a guest on a webinar or a podcast or anything like that, I know for sure that once I start talking, the anxiety tends to disappear because now my mind is focused on something else. And then the other thing I know is that as my mind quiets down, those feelings of urgency or anxiety will go away. So it's important to know those things. And then I was going to say a second thing about what you can do if you're feeling anxious. So continue to explore the inside out understanding. Oh, and then I think the second most important thing is to catch yourself, like notice what's happening when you're feeling anxious. And the thing is that very often we can be asleep to that. So it can be happening and we can have some sort of an automatic response. So for me, it might be, I'll go back to the errand example, automatically coming home and saying, forget it to a couple of my errands. I might have done that sort of when I was first beginning to understand this. And that's okay. I mean, when we fall asleep to this understanding, that's fine. You might catch it the next time. And so when you do, it's enough to notice and just try to remember, oh, right, this is my wisdom, my kind design, and it's letting me know that my thinking is really stirred up. And that's all it is. It's not information about the future. It's not information about bridges or traffic or anything like that. And I think it's important not to necessarily force yourself to change, to have that situation change, to try to force your anxiety to disappear. It's really enough, as I said earlier, to just simply continue to explore this understanding. And as you begin to realize and have your own personal insights about how we are designed and how these things work, then the anxiety is going to fall away all on its own. And then a third thing I will recommend is Nicola Bird's book, A Little Peace of Mind. So if you're watching on YouTube, I'm holding up the cover. It's a great book. And she used to teach workshops and that kind of thing. She doesn't do that anymore and really placed a focus on helping people with anxiety because she experienced it so much in her own personal life. And it really had an adverse effect. She talks about not being able to go on trips with her children and this thing about only being able to go 25 minutes away from her house because then her anxiety would flare up and tell her she had to get home. And so she had a really profound change once she came upon this understanding. So that's a great resource. The book is called A Little Piece of Mind, and her name is Nicola Bird. Bird is like the feathered animal. And you can ask for it at your local public library. It's available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. And Nicola herself recorded the audiobook. So you can, ask for it at your library, ask for the paperback at your local independent bookstore, and then it's also available in the online stores as well. So I highly recommend that. So that's it for today's Q&A episode. Thank you so much for joining me. And again, if you have any questions about that or about unwanted habits, let me know. alexandraamore.com/question. Thanks again so much for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.